You feed a lonely man long enough, and he begins to wonder what else your hands might be capable of. That was the case for Silas Granger, a man who hadn't felt a woman's touch or kindness in over a decade. Everything shifted the day a widowed cook answered his handwritten note pinned to the bulletin board at the town's general store. Need a cook? Good pay, no trouble. This story proves that the way to a man's heart, especially one hardened by grief and silence, is still through his stomach. But before we dive back in, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and how we can make this channel better for you. Whether it's praise or critique, your words matter and help us keep telling stories that resonate. The summer heat in Dry Creek, Wyoming, had a way of making even the toughest men feel small. Silas Granger stood 6'3" in his worn leather boots, but the emptiness of his ranch house made him feel like a ghost haunting his own land. At 44 years old, he'd been living off canned beans and coffee, strong enough to strip paint for longer than he cared to remember. The handwritten notice he'd tacked to the bulletin board at McAllister's Mercantile had been up for nearly a month. Most folks in town knew better than to approach the Granger Ranch. Silas had a reputation, not for cruelty, but for a silence so thick it could choke the life out of any conversation. Women crossed the street when they saw him coming, and men nodded respectfully from a distance. So when Miriam Caldwell stepped off the afternoon stagecoach with nothing but a carpetbag and determination in her hazel eyes, half the town stopped what they were doing to stare. She was 38, recently widowed, and wore her grief like a well-tailored coat, present but not showy. Her chestnut hair was pinned back tightly, and her dress was a practical black wool despite the heat. "I'm here about the cook position," she announced to McAllister behind the counter, her voice steady as the river that ran through town. McAllister's eyebrows shot up to his receding hairline. "Ma'am, you sure you got the right notice? That's Silas Granger's place. He ain't exactly social." Miriam's chin lifted a fraction. The notice said, "Good pay and no trouble. I can provide one and avoid the other." The ride out to the Granger Ranch took nearly an hour in McAllister's borrowed wagon. Miriam used the time to study the landscape, rolling hills dotted with cattle, fences in need of repair, and a loneliness that seemed to seep from the very earth itself. The ranch house came into view around a bend, and she understood immediately why Silas needed help. The place looked like a man had been living there alone for far too long. Laundry hung crooked on a line, dishes were stacked on the porch to dry, and the garden had surrendered to weeds months ago. But the bones were good. Solid log construction, a wide porch, and windows that would let in plenty of light if they weren't so grimy. Silas emerged from the barn. As the wagon approached, he moved with the careful economy of a man who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary gestures. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, streaked with silver at the temples, and his beard needed trimming. But his eyes, pale gray like a winter sky, were sharp and assessing. "You're the cook?" His voice was rougher than gravel, unused to conversation. "Miriam Caldwell," she said. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her practical shoes, the calluses on her hands, the way she didn't fidget under his scrutiny. "House is rough, works hard, pay is $30 a month plus room and board." It was more money than Miriam had seen in months. "When do I start?" "Now, if you're willing." McAllister helped unload her bag and departed with obvious relief, leaving Miriam alone with the most intimidating man she'd ever encountered. Silas led her through the house without commentary, letting her see for herself what she was getting into. The kitchen was functional, but grimy. The parlor looked like it hadn't been used in years, and upstairs 3 bedrooms sat empty and dust-covered. "You can have the room at the end of the hall," Silas said. "I take the one by the stairs." Miriam nodded, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. "What time do you prefer your meals?" "Whatever's convenient. I'm not particular." But as Miriam started her first dinner, fried chicken with biscuits and gravy, she caught Silas lingering near the kitchen doorway. He didn't come in, didn't speak, but she could feel his presence like heat from a banked fire. When she called him to eat, he sat at the table with the careful posture of a man who'd forgotten how to be comfortable indoors. The silence stretched between them as they ate. Miriam had endured enough awkward meals during her marriage to know when not to push conversation. But she watched him from the corner of her eye, noting how he savored each bite, how his shoulders gradually relaxed, how something almost like surprise crossed his features when he tasted her apple cobbler. After 3 days of shared meals and careful politeness, Silas finally broke their evening silence. Miriam was clearing dishes when his voice stopped her cold. "I haven't had a woman in 10 years. The words came out raw, unfiltered. He stared at his empty plate, knuckles white where they gripped his coffee cup. "I ate the food, now I crave the cook." Miriam's hands stilled on the serving platter. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dangerous fire. She could feel the heat creeping up her neck, a mixture of embarrassment and something else, something she hadn't felt since before her husband's death. "Mr. Granger," she said carefully, "I'm here to cook and keep house, nothing more." He nodded once sharply. "Understood. Just needed to say it." But the words had been spoken, and they changed everything. Miriam found herself hyper-aware of Silas's presence, the way he rolled up his sleeves when he washed for dinner, the rare times his laugh rumbled low in his chest, the careful distance he maintained whenever they moved around each other in the kitchen. A fragile working rhythm began, threaded through with an attraction neither of them was prepared to acknowledge. 3 weeks into her employment, Miriam discovered the first photograph while dusting the parlor mantel. It was face down behind a brass candlestick, as if hidden deliberately. The image showed a younger Silas with his arm around a petite woman with dark hair. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, sat on his shoulders, her smile bright enough to light up the faded photograph. Miriam studied their faces, the easy happiness, the casual intimacy of a family comfortable with love. She'd been wondering what had carved such deep lines around Silas's eyes, what had taught him to move through his own house like a stranger. Now she was beginning to understand. "You shouldn't be looking at that." Miriam spun around, the photograph clutched against her chest. Silas stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I was just dusting," she said. "I didn't mean to pry." He crossed the room and held out his hand. Miriam hesitated, then placed the photograph in his palm. He stared at it for a long moment before setting it back face down on the mantel. "Her name was Clara," he said finally. "My wife. The little one was Annie." The past tense hit Miriam like a physical blow. "What happened to them?" Silas's jaw worked silently for several seconds. "Fever took them. Winter of '84. I was in Denver selling cattle, gone for 2 weeks. His voice cracked slightly. "Came home to fresh graves and a house full of their ghosts." Miriam's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry. Shouldn't have left them alone." "Clara begged me not to go," said Annie was feeling poorly, "but the money was good and I thought—" He shook his head. "I've been blaming myself ever since." The revelation explained so much, his reluctance to get close to anyone, the way he seemed to punish himself with isolation. Miriam wanted to reach out to offer comfort, but she could see the walls rebuilding behind his eyes. That evening, as they sat over coffee and leftover pie, Miriam found herself sharing her own story. "My husband died 2 years ago, Thomas. He made some poor choices toward the end, lost money that wasn't his to lose. When he died, the people he owed came looking for payment. They took everything, the house, the furniture, even my wedding dress. The whole town turned against me, like his debts were somehow my fault." She traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. "I've been working wherever I could find it ever since. Your advertisement was an answer to prayer." Something shifted in Silas's expression. The defensive walls didn't crumble, but they developed cracks. "Folks can be cruel when they're scared," he said quietly. "Yes, they can." They sat in comfortable silence after that. Two people who understood what it meant to be branded by circumstances beyond their control. Over the following days, Miriam noticed small changes. Silas lingered longer at meals, asked occasional questions about her cooking, even smiled when she told him about the antics of McAllister's cat at the general store. Miriam found herself looking forward to these moments of connection. She began to notice things about him that had nothing to do with his reputation. The gentle way he handled injured cattle, how he always hung his hat on the same peg by the door, the careful attention he paid when she spoke. Her awareness of him as a man, rather than simply an employer, grew stronger each day. The night everything changed started with a thunderstorm that shook the house to its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like something wild and desperate. Miriam had been reading in the parlor when Silas appeared in the doorway, a cup of coffee in each hand. "Figured you might want some company," he said, offering her a cup. "These storms can be unsettling." They talked late into the night, about books, about their childhoods, about dreams they'd abandoned, and hopes they were afraid to voice. The conversation meandered like a lazy river, unhurried and natural. When Miriam's eyes began to droop, Silas suggested she rest on the parlor sofa rather than climbing the stairs in the dark. "I'll take the other end," he said, "just until the storm passes." It seemed reasonable, practical, even. Miriam curled up on one end of the wide sofa, while Silas stretched out on the other, both of them fully clothed and carefully maintaining their distance. The sound of rain on the roof was hypnotic, and exhaustion pulled them both towards sleep. Miriam woke sometime after midnight to the most terrifying sound she'd ever heard. A wet, desperate choking that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the realm of ordinary suffering. She sat up, disoriented, and saw Silas in the grip of something that defied explanation. His back was arched impossibly, his body rigid as iron, and he was suspended several inches above the sofa cushions. His eyes were rolled back, showing only white, and the choking sounds coming from his throat were inhuman. Most terrifying of all, he seemed completely unconscious, trapped in whatever nightmare had seized him. Miriam scrambled toward him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Silas, Silas, wake up!" She grabbed his shoulders, shaking him desperately. But her hands passed through empty air where his body should have been solid. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized she couldn't touch him. Whatever was happening existed in a space between the physical world and something else entirely. "Come back," she screamed, her voice breaking. "Come back to me." Without thinking, she drew back her hand and slapped the space where his face hung suspended. The crack of her palm connecting with something solid echoed through the room, and Silas crashed down onto the sofa like a stone dropped from a great height. He gasped, his whole body convulsing as he struggled to draw breath. His eyes were wild, unfocused, and for a moment, Miriam thought he might not recognize her. Then his gaze found hers, and she saw confusion mixed with something that might have been gratitude. "Miriam," his voice was barely a whisper, his throat raw. "I'm here," she said, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch but desperate to offer comfort. "You're safe, you're back." He pushed himself upright, running shaking hands through his hair. "Did I? What did you see?" Miriam described what had happened, watching his face grow paler with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "It's been happening since they died," he said. "The choking sometimes. Sometimes I feel like I'm being pulled somewhere else, somewhere dark." "Have you seen a doctor?" Silas's laugh was bitter. "Doc Peterson says it's just nightmares, guilt manifesting in dreams. But it doesn't feel like dreams, Miriam. It feels like something wants me gone." The implications of his words sent ice through Miriam's veins. She'd heard stories, whispers about grief so deep it could tear holes between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. Her grandmother had called it the calling, when the dead tried to pull the living along with them. The next morning, Silas was quiet and distant. He ate his breakfast without tasting it, avoided her eyes, and spent the day working so far from the house that Miriam couldn't even see him from the windows. When he finally came in for dinner, the careful intimacy they'd built over weeks had evaporated like morning dew. "Mr. Granger," Miriam began, but he cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "Best we don't talk about what happened," he said. "Best we pretend it didn't happen at all." But Miriam couldn't pretend. She'd seen the terror in his eyes, felt the supernatural cold that had filled the room during his episode. Whatever was haunting Silas Granger was more than guilt or nightmares. It was something with claws sharp enough to drag a man's soul right out of his body. The trouble started with a knock on the door. 3 days later, Miriam was kneading bread when she heard horses approaching, their hoofbeats sharp against the packed earth of the yard. Through the kitchen window, she saw 3 men dismounting. 2 she didn't recognize, and 1 she wished she'd never seen. Preston Cartwright owned half the businesses in Dry Creek and wanted to own the other half. He was 45, soft around the middle, with a kind of smooth hands that had never known honest work. Miriam knew him by reputation as a man who collected debts and properties with equal ruthlessness. Silas emerged from the barn, and Miriam watched through the window as the confrontation unfolded. She couldn't hear the words, but Cartwright's gestures were aggressive, proprietary. One of his companions kept glancing toward the house, his meaning clear. They knew about Miriam's presence and considered it significant. When the men finally rode away, Silas's face was thunderous. He stalked into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly. "What did they want?" Miriam asked. "Same thing Cartwright always wants, my land." Silas's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Says I owe money to the bank in town. Says if I can't pay, he's prepared to make a generous offer for the ranch." Miriam frowned. "Do you owe money?" "Not a cent, but Cartwright's got friends at the bank, and I've got no proof of what I've paid." He looked at her with something that might have been regret. He also had some interesting questions about my domestic arrangements. Heat flooded Miriam's cheeks. What kind of questions? The kind that could ruin a woman's reputation. The kind that make it clear he knows we were both on that sofa the other night. Miriam's hands stilled on the bread dough. How could he possibly know about that? Silas's expression darkened further. "Cartwright's got eyes and ears all over this county. Could be McAllister's been talking. Could be one of the ranch hands saw something and sold the information. Doesn't matter how he knows. What matters is he's planning to use it." The implications settled over Miriam like a cold fog. In a town like Dry Creek, the suggestion of impropriety between an unmarried man and woman could destroy both their reputations. For Miriam, it could mean being run out of town entirely. For Silas, it could provide Cartwright with the leverage he needed to force a sale of the ranch. "What are we going to do?" Miriam asked. Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. "You're going to pack your things," he said finally. "I'll arrange passage on tomorrow's stage." Miriam's hands clenched into fists. "You're sending me away. I'm protecting you and myself." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Cartwright can't use what doesn't exist. You leave, the gossip dies down, and we both go back to our lives." The casual dismissal hit Miriam like a physical blow. Just like that. After everything they'd shared, Silas's jaw tightened. What we've shared is meals and conversation, nothing more. But Miriam could see the lie in his eyes. Could hear it in the careful way he avoided looking at her directly. The connection between them was real, powerful, and terrifying in its intensity. Running away from it wouldn't make it disappear. It would only leave them both diminished. Still, she understood the logic. She'd been running from consequences her entire adult life, and she was tired of bringing trouble to people who didn't deserve it. That evening, she began packing her few belongings, each folded garment feeling like a small defeat. She was placing her mother's Bible in the carpetbag when she heard Silas choking again. The sound froze her blood. She dropped the Bible and ran toward the stairs, but stopped when she realized the sound was coming from his bedroom. The door was closed, and she could hear him thrashing around, making those same inhuman noises that had terrified her 3 nights before. Miriam pressed her ear to the door, torn between the need to help and the knowledge that entering his bedroom would confirm every rumor Cartwright wanted to spread. The choking grew worse, more desperate, and she heard a heavy thud, as if his body had hit the floor. Her hand was on the doorknob when the sound suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the choking. It was the silence of held breath, of a heart that might have stopped beating altogether. Miriam eased the door open and peered inside. Silas lay motionless on the floor beside his bed, his face pale as candle wax in the moonlight streaming through the window. She couldn't tell if he was breathing. "Silas," she whispered. No response. She moved closer, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw his eyes. They were open but completely empty, staring at something she couldn't see. His lips were blue, and there were angry red marks around his throat, as if invisible hands had been choking him. Miriam knelt beside him and pressed her ear to his chest. His heartbeat was there but faint, irregular. She shook his shoulders gently, then with increasing urgency, but he remained locked in whatever trance had seized him. This time was worse than before. This time there was no dramatic levitation, no obvious supernatural display, just a man slowly dying from the inside out, pulled toward some dark place by invisible chains. And this time, Miriam was alone with him, the only thing standing between Silas Granger and whatever wanted to claim him. Miriam didn't sleep that night. She stayed beside Silas on the floor of his bedroom, monitoring his breathing, talking to him, even though he couldn't hear her. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, about the apple tree behind her father's house, about the dreams she'd had before life taught her to stop dreaming. Sometime near dawn, his eyes fluttered and focused on her face. The confusion was there again, but also something else. Relief so profound it made her chest ache. "You stayed," he whispered. "Of course I stayed." He struggled to sit up, and Miriam helped him, acutely aware of how his weight leaned into her, how solid and warm he felt after hours of watching him hover between life and whatever lay beyond. They sat on his bedroom floor as the sun crept through the windows, neither of them speaking about the impropriety of the situation. "It was different this time," Silas said eventually, stronger. "I could feel it pulling me toward them. Clara and Annie, they were calling me to come with them." Miriam's throat tightened. "But you didn't go." "I heard your voice pulling me back." He looked at her with something that might have been wonder. "How did you know to keep talking?" "I didn't know anything. I was just scared of losing you." The admission hung between them, honest and raw. Silas reached out and touched her hand, the first time he'd initiated physical contact since she'd arrived at his ranch. "Miriam, I need to tell you something about the night they died." She waited, sensing that whatever he was about to share would change everything. "I wasn't just in Denver selling cattle," he said. "I was also seeing another woman, a woman who made me feel young again, who made me forget how tired I was of responsibility." His voice cracked. "Clara knew. She begged me not to go, not because Annie was sick, but because she knew what I was going to do. And I went anyway." Miriam felt her heart break for all of them. For Clara, betrayed and abandoned in her final days. For Annie, too young to understand why her father wasn't there. And for Silas, carrying a guilt so heavy it was literally killing him. "The fever might have taken them anyway," Miriam said quietly. "You can't know. I know that I chose another woman over my family. I know that Clara died believing I loved someone else more than her." Tears ran down his weathered cheeks. "And maybe I did. Maybe that's why I can't let them rest. Maybe that's why they keep calling me to join them." Miriam understood now why the choking episodes were getting worse. Why whatever haunted him was growing stronger. Guilt was a poison that killed slowly, and Silas had been drinking it for 10 years. "You want to know what I think?" she said. "I think you're being haunted, but not by your wife and daughter. I think you're being haunted by your own shame, and it's gotten so strong it's trying to kill you." She took his hands in both of hers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life. "Your wife and daughter don't want you dead, Silas. They want you to stop punishing yourself and start living again." That night, Miriam made a decision that would have scandalized half of Dry Creek. She brought blankets and pillows to Silas's bedroom and made a bed for herself on the floor beside his bed. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Making sure you don't face whatever comes alone," she said simply. He opened his mouth to argue, then Miriam closed it with a kiss. "I'm staying," he gasped. "I'm staying here with you." The cold receded like a tide going out. Silas's body relaxed, settling back onto the bed as if invisible chains had been cut. They spent the rest of the night talking about the future, about improvements they could make to the ranch, about the possibility of expanding the herd, about what it might mean to build a life together in this harsh, beautiful country. When Preston Cartwright rode up 3 days later with legal papers and a smug expression, he found Miriam hanging laundry on the line while Silas repaired the front porch steps. They moved around each other with a quiet confidence, and when Cartwright began his usual threats about debts and reputations, Silas simply laughed. "You know what, Cartwright," he said, setting down his hammer. "I don't care what people say about me and Miriam. I don't care if you think living with a good woman makes me weak or improper. I've spent 10 years dead inside, and I'm finally alive again. You can take your legal papers and your gossip and get off my land." Cartwright sputtered and threatened, but his power had always come from fear and shame, against a man who had faced down his own demons and chosen to live. Cartwright's petty cruelties held no weight on Silas Granger. As the seasons turned and the ranch prospered under their combined efforts, Miriam and Silas discovered something neither had expected to find again: contentment. Not the desperate passion of youth, but the deeper satisfaction of two people who had been broken by life and found in each other the strength to heal. The choking episode stopped entirely. Whatever had been calling Silas toward death seemed to understand that he was no longer willing to answer. He still carried the scars of his past, still grieved for the family he had lost. But the grief no longer threatened to consume him. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset over the Wyoming hills, Miriam would sometimes catch Silas looking at her with an expression of profound gratitude. He never again spoke the words that had started it all about craving the cook after tasting her food. But the sentiment lived in every shared meal, every comfortable silence, every night they spent sleeping safely in the same room, and every kiss. You feed a lonely man long enough, and he starts wondering what else your hands are good at. But feed him with love instead of just food, and he discovers that your hands are good at everything that matters: healing, holding, helping him remember how to be human again. Silas Granger had been a dead man walking for 10 years. Miriam Caldwell had been running from her past just as long. Together they learned that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to fully, completely, courageously live.